On October 14, 2022, the environmentalist group Just Stop Oil made headlines after its members threw tomato soup at Van Gogh's famous Sunflowers painting.
Are you more concerned about the protection of a painting or the protection of our planet and people?
Overnight, the backlash turned them into a household name. Since then, Just Stop Oil has continued making the news for their theatrics, interrupting sports games and even shutting down highways across the United Kingdom to protest the use of fossil fuels. These protests have given them an unfavorable reputation with parts of the public, to the point where some even wonder if they're being paid by oil companies to make environmentalists look bad. This leads us to a couple of questions. Where did Just Stop Oil come from? Who is funding them? And what else have they gotten up to in the past few years? In 2017, a 52-year-old PhD student named Roger Hallam was arrested for spray painting anti-oil messages on the walls of his university. Though he was charged £500, he did it again the following month, and a few weeks later began a 2-week hunger strike in an effort to have King's College London divest themselves from fossil fuels. The university caved and pledged to do so by 2025. Roger took this as a win and told The Independent, quote, "This is a groundbreaking campaign for how to combat this system, a model that can be replicated." Emboldened by his success, Roger involved himself with climate activist groups to teach his tactics to others. That summer, Roger joined the group Stop Killing Londoners, where he'd help organize road blockades on London's busiest streets. He said his peaceful protest tactics were inspired by that of Gandhi. The public's reaction was mixed. Although many agreed with the group's message, they found the blockades to be a nuisance that weakened the legitimacy of their concerns. Activists from SKL nevertheless continued with these methods of protest into the fall, at one point getting arrested for spray painting cut air pollution on London's City Hall. Though they were granted bail, one of the conditions was that they stay over 160 feet away from the building, which they breached just days later. When Roger and 3 others from SKL were arrested over the violation, the group put out a press release condemning the move by saying, quote, "Today, the 4 of us are being sent to prison because we apparently care too much. We care about the 25 people who are killed every day in London by the illegal levels of air pollution." Roger went on to form the environmentalist group Extinction Rebellion in 2018, where he promoted nonviolent action like holding a funeral for the planet. This involved carrying a coffin into Buckingham Palace, for which over a dozen protesters were arrested. The Times wrote that such protests put a strain on emergency services, with ambulances cut off from their routes and hundreds of police officers deployed to contain the protesters. Extinction Rebellion nevertheless continued these tactics into 2019, including dumping gallons of fake blood all over Downing Street and stripping naked in the House of Commons. Roger insisted that the group had to grow considerably if their demands were to be taken seriously, telling the BBC, quote, "The police will go to the government and say, 'We're not doing it anymore.' They're not there to start arresting 84-year-old grannies or 10-year-old kids. There has to be a political solution." During training sessions, Roger taught skills like evading police and dealing with angry civilians. He was confident that although their tactics would frustrate commuters, the average person would eventually come around to Extinction Rebellion's message about climate change. In September, Roger and 4 others were arrested ahead of a planned protest involving flying drones close to Heathrow Airport and obstructing flights, a response to plans to add a 3rd runway to the facility. He compared the climate crisis to the threat posed by the Nazis in 1936 and called the airport's expansion a, quote, "crime against humanity." Though Roger was released on bail with the condition that he go nowhere near Heathrow nor have any possession of drones, he was arrested again 2 days later after Extinction Rebellion tweeted that he intended to go ahead with his plans anyways. Roger found himself in deeper trouble after making remarks about the Holocaust, which many German politicians criticize as undermining and flippant. As a result, he lost out on a book publishing deal. Similar remarks put Roger at odds with the German wing of Extinction Rebellion when he made comparisons between climate change and the atrocities at Auschwitz. Roger formally left Extinction Rebellion following this controversy. In an interview with the Center for Post-Capitalist Society, Roger berated the radical left for being overrun by what he called the, quote, "privileged urban middle class," and urged a return to focusing on the working class. He also said that a major problem activists face worldwide was, quote, "the inability to radicalize global youth, especially when it came to the issue of climate change." Roger started a new climate action group called Just Stop Oil in February 2022, and the organization immediately issued demands to the British government to divest from all new oil projects. Failing to do so would lead to JSO acting on what they called their, quote, duty to intervene, promising to disrupt oil production by targeting refineries and even gas stations should their demands be refused. Among Rogers' recruits were college students whose fears about climate change were validated by the organization's goals. He began a series of university talks with the aim of promoting the group to impressionable young adults. During the talks, Roger warned that the climate crisis would mean the end of the world and that it demanded immediate radical action. In March, the BBC reported that the group had begun targeting soccer games, with members tying themselves to goalposts to disrupt the matches while angry crowds booed. By April, Just Stop Oil made good on their commitment to target oil production, blockading roads used to access oil refineries across Britain, with the new college student recruits comprising the bulk of the protesting force. Hundreds of protesters successfully cut off access to ExxonMobil's facilities, causing temporary closures until law enforcement stepped in. Within days, fuel shortages were reported by citizens across the United Kingdom. After 2 weeks, the number of JSO activists arrested was reaching 1,000, and the group promised they wouldn't stop until the entire organization was jailed. The spokesman for the Prime Minister denounced the group's methods, saying they were unfairly bringing the lives of British citizens to a halt. But despite their previous vows of unending protests, JSO put a week-long deferment on its demonstrations in mid-April to give the Prime Minister, quote, the opportunity to make a statement on behalf of the government that it will immediately halt all future licensing and consents for the exploration, development, and production of fossil fuels in the UK. They warned, however, that they would escalate their tactics if the Prime Minister failed to take action and end fossil fuel use immediately. The Guardian learned that one of JSO's main financial backers was an American nonprofit organization called the Climate Emergency Fund. By April 2022, the CEF had already given over $500,000 to British environmentalist groups. One of the CEF's biggest contributors was an American philanthropist named Eileen Getty, granddaughter of the famous oil tycoon John Paul Getty. Observers were quick to point out the irony of this, with some speculating whether Just Stop Oil was a type of controlled opposition meant to damage the public profile and credibility of real climate activist groups. Eileen stated that she had, in fact, made her contributions as a form of restitution to the world for her family's ill-begotten wealth. JSO protesters kept busy throughout the spring and summer of 2022, vandalizing gas stations and interrupting races at the British Grand Prix. They also began targeting art galleries, with a pair of activists gluing themselves to the frame of a John Constable painting. Though these stunts led to dozens of arrests, representatives from JSO vowed that the threat of jail time would not shake the resolve of their activists. Road closures by JSO protesters continued on the routes to oil storage depots, along with the blockading of multiple bridges and main roads in the cities. Activists even began gluing themselves to the road to make it more difficult for police to remove them. Unsurprisingly, the general public was losing patience with the constant disruption of their daily lives. Some individuals were filmed dragging protesters off the road and kicking away their banners during demonstrations. A spokesman from JSO believed these were but one-off instances that didn't reflect the public at large's opinion. Nevertheless, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner voiced his frustrations that these constant disruptions were drawing police manpower away from more serious emergencies. The most infamous JSO stunt took place in mid-October, when students Phoebe Plummer and Anna Holland were arrested after throwing a can of tomato soup at Van Gogh's Sunflowers painting.
What is worth more, art or life? Is it worth more than food? Worth more than justice? Fuel is unaffordable to millions of cold, hungry families. They can't even afford to heat a tin of soup.
Though the frame was damaged, the painting itself avoided any permanent ruin thanks to a glass barrier protecting it. Phoebe and Anna were immediately arrested and charged with criminal damage and aggravated trespass. Even supporters of Just Stop Oil denounced the Van Gogh painting attack, saying that they were choosing the wrong targets while also wasting food. On the other hand, Eileen Getty penned an opinion piece in The Guardian voicing her support for the protest, arguing that disruptive action was necessary for any real change to be made. The same day, over 20 JSO activists were apprehended after dousing the Metropolitan Police Headquarters with yellow paint. apparently to call attention to how many of their kin had spent months in prison after being arrested for their own acts of vandalism. Just Stop Oil responded with a statement wherein they decried the police for, quote, imprisoning over 100 people for acting to protect humanity. Following amped-up protests throughout London in mid-October, the Conservative government announced plans to crack down on the disruptive protests by providing additional powers to police. In a recap of the art gallery protest, the Jerusalem Post pointed out the irony of JSO accepting cryptocurrency donations, which were noted as using the same amount of energy for every transaction that the average American household burns in 2.5 days. The article also shed light on the growing conversation online over whether JSO was an organic movement or part of a smear campaign by the oil industry against environmentalists. Though the Jerusalem Post concluded that the group was sincere in its beliefs, it cautioned that incidents like the one at the National Art Gallery could do more harm for their cause than good. Phoebe Plummer and Anna Holland both pled not guilty to charges of vandalism after appearing in a London courtroom, with their lawyer insisting that the burden of proof was on prosecutors to show that they had damaged the Van Gogh painting's frame. Both young women were released on bail, under the provision that they avoid public galleries and refrain from carrying adhesives and paint in public. On October 17th, Just Stop Oil protesters shut down the Dartford Crossings QE2 bridge after several activists were seen scaling the structure's steel cables. Commuters were left infuriated after they were stuck waiting for hours as police worked to remove the climbers. Some social media users pointed out that the group was putting lives at risk by blocking emergency vehicles from their destinations. JSO co-founders Roger Hallam and Indigo Rumbelow were arrested in early morning raids on October 19th on suspicion of conspiracy to cause a public nuisance. This was over Roger's plans to expand the traffic blockades across England. JSO decried the move as a massive overreach by what they called a criminal government. As the British government plowed ahead with more expansive powers for police to crack down on the protests, a JSO representative brushed it off by saying that only the death sentence would deter them from continuing their work. Just Stop Oil's closure of the Dartford Crossing Bridge left a sour taste in the mouth of the public, especially after it came out that the group's actions may have inadvertently caused the deaths of 2 women. It was believed that the traffic diversions caused by the protests led to unruly conditions on the M20 motorway, which caused the fatal car crash. One man who had been badly injured while assisting the deceased blamed the protesters, telling the Express, quote, "The eco-warriors may have thought it was an innocent protest, but they've got blood on their hands. I don't think they deliberately caused the crash, but their actions, bringing the traffic to a standstill on the M20, caused the crash in which those 2 women died." These accusations didn't stop JSO from organizing more closures of freeways like the M25 in November, with activist Louise Harris leading the charge. Louise had previously made headlines for interrupting a soccer match where rowdy fans pelted her with drinks from the stands. She compared herself to an Irish prisoner of war in a social media post where she decried public frustration, then used her newfound infamy to plug her debut song, "Dating Me Is Like a Cambridge Term."
All boys, they try to date me. They don't know that I'm crazy.
During her protest on the M25, Louise made a tearful video where she called on angry commuters to redirect their rage towards the government.
Hello, my name is Louise. I'm 24 years old, and I'm here. I'm here because I don't have a future. And you might hate me for doing this, and you're entitled to hate me. But I wish you would direct all that anger and hatred at our government. They are betraying young people like me. I wouldn't have to be there if they did their lawful duty to their own citizens.
Even with Louise's request, the public didn't show much sympathy towards JSO's message. Actress Amanda Abington, who was caught in the traffic holdup, pointed out on Twitter the self-defeating nature of the protest. Quote, "Congratulations to the oil protesters on the M25 who have caused a massive traffic jam. Hundreds of cars burning off loads of oil and petrol." JSO tried to pass off responsibility for the traffic jam by saying they had told police to set up detours ahead of their demonstration, but were ignored. Louise, along with at least 34 cohorts, were swiftly arrested. The Met Police promised that decisive action would be taken to prevent further disruptions. Nevertheless, JSO was at it again on the M25 the next day. One man missed his father's funeral because of the protest, telling the BBC, quote, "I will never, ever forgive these people for what they've done to me." On November 9th, a police officer was hurt after being knocked off his motorcycle by 2 trucks during the ongoing M25 protests. A spokesman for Just Stop Oil blamed government inaction on ending fossil fuel extraction for the crash. Home Secretary Suella Braverman continued to call for firmer action from police to break up the disruptive JSO protests, saying they constituted a, quote, threat to our way of life. Critics from various civil liberty organizations condemned the Home Secretary's push for the expansion of police powers, worrying that they would have a, quote, chilling effect on the right to protest. That same day, a host for ITV's Good Morning Britain warned a JSO spokesman that the group's tactics were having a negative effect on public perception of the organization.
You also say the public's on your side, but the latest polling from YouGov says that they asked the question, do your sympathies lie more with the climate change protesters or the motorists who are being stopped on the M25? 8% sympathise with you, 52% sympathise with the motorists. That is not getting people on your side.
She prematurely ended the interview after growing annoyed by his constant interruptions.
Have you watched this programme?
No.
Right, okay, so you don't have any idea what this programme does. You have no idea who our meteorologist is, Laura Tobin, who's one of the most outspoken people on climate change, who has written an entire book talking about what we each need to do as individuals on climate change. And you have the audacity to come on here and say that we're completely distracted and we're not talking about the issues. We talk about them every single morning, Sam. You're not getting people on your side, including people who would naturally be sympathetic to your cause. Sorry, and I'm going to end it there because you've already said you don't watch and you don't care. Sam, thanks very much indeed. And Fraser, thanks very much indeed.
Despite the promise of more powers to deal with the protesters, one police chief admitted, quote, we're not going to arrest our way out of environmental protest. Another police commissioner believed that the foot soldiers of the JSO movement were being exploited by the higher-ups, likening their appeals to impressionable college students to a form of grooming. On November 11th, demonstrators agreed to immediately end their occupation of the M25. They claimed this would allow the government time to, quote, do the right thing. Indigo Rumbelow had a blow-up interview with Sky News' Mark Austin that same morning, wherein she pressed Mark on whether or not he loved his kids.
The rains have failed in Somalia for the 5th year in a row, meaning mothers cannot feed their children.
But we know that, and we covered that. We had correspondents out there. There is a COP27 conference.
You may have been covering it, but the media has failed to make political change.
Hang on, we've got...
Politics has failed us. I'm 28. This is the 27th COP conference. And what has happened every single year? The emissions have risen and risen and risen. If you were doing your job properly, everyone would be out on the streets.
So we have a
But they're not. And I really want you to understand. Do you know how grave the situation is?
I do understand,
and do you have children?
I've got children.
And do you love those children?
Indigo, please, I understand the point you're making. You are here today to justify the tactics. You're effectively
Do you love those children more than you love fossil fuels?
You are committing a crime. Why should...
That's what we're asking you to do. We're asking you to side with young people who are asking our government very politely, in line with the UN, saying that we need to come off fossil fuels.
That's one point.
With the knowledge that we're going to go over 1.5 degrees and this will undermine the rule of law. We're asking people...
Stop shouting at me.
Her father told the Daily Mail that he couldn't be more proud of her for her stance, although the tabloid was quick to point out the hypocrisy of him driving a Range Rover. It went on to point out Indigo's own worldwide trips via airplane, accusing her of a double standard. By late November, JSO announced that traffic disruptions would continue over the Christmas holidays. Leaked internal documents suggested that supporters time their protests for rush hour in order to have maximum effect. The latest tactic involved walking very slowly on busy roads in front of traffic, essentially bringing it to a crawl. The group continued to draw the frustration of the Prime Minister, who held various meetings with police agencies to figure out a means of dealing with the pesky protesters. Activist Jan Goody was sentenced to 6 months in prison for his role in causing a public nuisance during the freeway protests in early November. JSO took issue with the sentencing, telling the media, quote, this shows that our government would rather lock up peaceful protesters than put an end to new oil and gas. We know that the course they are setting is going to destroy everything we know and love, and that is why we must resist. We will continue to do everything non-violently possible to stop this horror. Despite the police asking the public not to go after protesters, the activists found themselves on the defensive as enraged commuters hurled cuss words and middle fingers at them and told them to get jobs. The latest protests also saw the public's anger boil over onto the police, who they believed were too slow to react to this fresh wave of disruptions. A spokesman for Just Stop Oil complained that it was, quote, insane that people cared more about their attack on the Van Gogh artworks than about the flooding in Pakistan going on at the time. He warned that the group's next step may be to start slashing up paintings, a nod to the drastic move taken by suffragettes in the 1910s. In March 2023, Phoebe Plummer got into an argument on live television with presenter Jacob Rees-Mogg, during which she asked if he even cared about his own children.
Jacob, you have 6 children? Do you not care about their future? Do you not care about them being able to feed themselves?
He responded by telling her she should run for office if she wanted to make a difference rather than throw soup on a priceless artwork.
For an end to all new fossil fuels. What makes you think that I have time to get into power and make these changes?
So you want to be a dictator? You don't want voters to decide?
That's absolutely not what I said, and you know that.
Why don't you stand for election? Put yourself forward and see if people want your way.
Because we don't have time.
2 of the protesters accused of climbing the Dartford Crossing Bridge the previous October were handed down prison sentences of over 2.5 years each, the longest sentences over climate protests in Britain to that point. The judge specified that he ordered the severe sentencing to act as a deterrent against copycats. Climate activists consider this far too harsh a sentencing over what they believed was on behalf of an important cause. By June, police were approved for enhanced powers to deal with climate protesters by the British government, specifically those engaging in the slow walk protest designed to bring traffic to a standstill. Critics called it an infringement on their legal right to protest, and argued that the police already had the powers necessary to clamp down on such forms of civil disobedience. The BBC added that this was the second time in 2 years that police were given greater authority to quash protests, following a change in 2022 that allowed them to shut down demonstrations deemed too noisy. Later that month, JSO threatened to protest London's Pride Parade over their sponsor, United Airlines, demanding that the group publicly reveal their sponsors and to denounce the use of oil and gas. True to their word, JSO interrupted the Pride Parade after they failed to meet the demands. 7 protesters wound up being arrested after a 16-minute-long demonstration. 2 of the protesters arrested for climbing the Dartford Crossing Bridge filed appeals in July, with their lawyer arguing that the lengthy sentences could have a, quote, chilling effect on all protest. One of the accused called the judgment unfair because it didn't take the climate crisis into account. He argued that the sentence would negatively impact his family, saying, quote, it's very hard to have that disruption in our family life. The protester was confident that the thousands of people held up by his protest, which included a pregnant woman needing urgent medical attention, would consent to the disruption they faced if they knew the full scale of the pain and suffering of those already losing their lives every year. The judge offered no leniency, however, scolding the men for thinking they knew better than everyone else. The appeals were denied that October. JSO took a major blow after millionaire backer Dale Vince announced he would no longer fund them. He believed that further demonstrations from the group would be counterproductive, and that it would only, quote, feed the Tories' culture war narrative. Later in the month, climate activist Greta Thunberg was arrested alongside Indigo Rumbelow and Roger Hallam for trying to block attendees from entering an energy conference they derided as the Oscars of the oil industry. An opinion piece written by one of JSO's founders suggested targeting the homes of politicians who weren't bending to their will, which was condemned by Labour MP Stella Creasy as the kind of behavior that led to the slaying of British politician Joe Cox in 2016. Nevertheless, Phoebe Plummer broke her bail agreement to go ahead with a plan to attach a letter to the home of a prominent Labour MP, only to wind up taping it to the wrong house in a totally different neighbourhood. The politician made light of the incident on Twitter. JSO owned up to the blunder and asked that the homeowner deliver the message themselves to the MP's real address. The Telegraph wrote that Phoebe had been caught on video, quote, taunting police and telling them she is breaching bail conditions. She was quickly apprehended over conspiracy to burgle and sending malicious communications. Phoebe Plummer went to trial in May 2024 over her participation in one of the slow walk protests in November 2023. Speaking to the bench, she remained indignant that she was being detained over what she called 20 minutes of marching. Phoebe complained about the heat in the courtroom, using it as proof of the imminency of the climate crisis. In her closing statements, she insisted, quote, It was not my intention to delay anyone. I don't want to cause delay or disruption to anyone. The jury found Phoebe and her cohorts guilty 11-1. 2 elderly ladies from JSO were charged for smashing up the glass around the Magna Carta, with the message being that the government was not above the law when it came to imprisoning JSO foot soldiers. The 800-year-old document was undamaged. Next, JSO protesters targeted Stonehenge in mid-June, dousing the ancient structure with orange powder paint just days before the summer solstice celebration. This was met with widespread condemnation across the political spectrum. There was great concern that prehistoric markings on the monument would be damaged, along with several natural lichens that had been growing on it. Just Stop Oil defended its actions, however, by saying it was simply dyed corn flour that would wash off with rain. The rocks were carefully cleaned with blown air, which managed to keep the algae colonies intact. Later in the month, Phoebe Plummer and Anna Holland were found guilty over their roles in attacking the Van Gogh painting with soup. The pair was unsurprisingly upset about the ruling. During the trial for those accused of shutting down the M25, the judge imposed restrictions on how much they could use the climate crisis as a justification for their crimes. His reasoning was that it was simply not relevant to the case at hand. The accused argued that the gag order may inhibit jurors from making an informed decision over whether or not to convict. Several detained protesters went ahead anyways and brought up climate change, and as a result were found in contempt of court. Roger Hallam, along with 4 others, were convicted of conspiracy to shut down the M25 in 2022. He was handed 5 years in prison, and the others each received 4. It was believed the harsh punishments were to set an example against the increasingly rambunctious actions of climate groups across Britain. Amnesty International said they were alarmed by the decision, imploring the government to be wary of cracking down on peaceful protests. The United Nations also chimed in to express disapproval for the sentences, with Special Rapporteur Michael Force labeling them, quote, punitive and repressive, and, quote, not acceptable in a democracy. Though there were calls for the government to intervene, the Labour Party refused to involve itself in judicial matters. Phoebe Plummer and Anna Holland gave an interview to The Times, wherein Phoebe admitted she had felt empowered by throwing the soup on the Van Gogh painting but argued she was no criminal. Anna dismissed the idea that their very visible protest might turn people off of their cause, saying, quote, this isn't a popularity contest. Phoebe, on the other hand, brushed off claims that her upper-class upbringing in a multi-million-dollar mansion introduced an element of hypocrisy to their approach, especially when it was pointed out that JSO's protests disproportionately affected the poorest members of British society. She told The Times, quote, I don't have to work 3 jobs to feed my kids or pay my heating bills, which means that I can dedicate time towards fighting for people that don't have the means to fight. Phoebe later told The Telegraph that her father was a climate denialist. She was reportedly disowned by her one brother after she told her mother she felt nothing but grief about the idea of him starting a family. Ultimately, Phoebe was sentenced to 2 years behind bars, whereas Anna received 20 months. The judge scolded her by saying, quote, you clearly think your beliefs give you the right to commit crimes when you feel like it. You do not. The defiant women blew kisses at the public gallery watching, after comparing their actions to that of Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. Hours following the sentencing, the Sunflowers painting was once again hit with cans of tomato soup by JSO activists outraged by the outcome. This led to the National Gallery instituting a ban on liquids. As of March 2025, there appears to be no end to the antics of Just Stop Oil, with members of the group throwing paint over the grave of Charles Darwin and continuing to interrupt public events to get their message out to the masses. In late January, hundreds of protesters gathered outside the High Court in London as appeals were heard for 16 of JSO's activists. Labeling the incarcerated as political prisoners similar to Nelson Mandela, their supporters demanded their immediate release. With the decision over the appeal expected to take several weeks, Roger Hallam and dozens of other Just Stop Oil activists continue to serve prison time as of the publishing of this video.